"Don't put Walter on the loan form," my son said in front of the banker. "They've called him broke for 20 years because he is." The room went still, around a $418,000 problem, and the banker looked at me the way people look when they know a secret they are not allowed to speak. My daughter-in-law smiled like the matter had been settled, and my son tapped the table as if I were a loose receipt. What none of them understood was that the banker's silence was not agreement. It was confidentiality. If you've ever been judged by people who confused quiet with weakness, stay to the end. This is not a story about buying respect. It is about what happens when the truth finally walks into a room where pride has been talking too long. My name is Walter Ellis. I am 71 years old, and I spent most of my public life repairing ovens, washers, and old restaurant equipment. I was the man people called when a freezer quit at midnight or a dryer started smoking on a Saturday. What most of my family never knew was that I used those service calls to learn which small buildings were failing, which owners were tired, and which overlooked corners of town could become steady income if someone had patience. Let me back up. My wife Ruth and I married when I had $640, 2 toolboxes, and a used van that stalled whenever it rained. Ruth worked the front desk at a dental office and kept a ledger so neat it made my sloppy handwriting look ashamed. Our first investment was a duplex with peeling paint and a basement that smelled like wet cardboard. The seller wanted out fast. The bank wanted proof I could handle repairs, and Ruth said, "We can be poor on purpose for 5 years if it keeps us from being scared for 50. So we lived small. We packed lunches, skipped vacations, and did repairs after my regular workday ended. I learned plumbing by flooding my own shoes. Ruth learned leases by reading every state handbook she could find. Within 8 years, we owned 3 duplexes and a small strip of garage units behind a grocery store. Within 15 years, we had 11 rental doors, 24 storage units, and no debt except one mortgage we could have paid off but kept for tax reasons. Ruth understood better than I did. The money did not make us loud. Ruth hated loud money. She grew up watching relatives turn every raise into a performance and every gift into a hook. When our son Bryce was young, she made me promise we would help him without making him lazy and love him without making him dependent. "Never use money as a drum," she told me. "If you beat it hard enough, everyone comes running, but not everyone comes loving." After Ruth died, I kept that promise almost too well. I sold 7 properties at the right time, kept the best 5, and let a local trust company manage the accounts. Between rentals, municipal bonds, and the sale proceeds, I was worth a little over $8 million by my late 60s. But I still lived in the same white house with a sagging porch rail, wore plain shirts from discount bins, and drove a 22-year-old van because it started every morning and knew the way home. Bryce knew I owned a few rentals once, but he thought I had sold them to survive. That belief hardened into a family joke. At cookouts, if someone forgot paper plates, my daughter-in-law Tara would laugh and say, "Ask Walter, he probably saves them from restaurants." When Christmas came, she inspected my envelopes before opening them, as if a small gift confirmed a larger failure. I let it pass because Ruth had taught me that not every insult deserves rent in your head. The first disrespect was small enough to excuse. My granddaughter Emily was 10 when she painted me a mug that said "Best Fixer." I kept it on my kitchen shelf. At a family barbecue, Tara saw it and said, "That is perfect. Grandpa fixes things because he cannot afford new ones." People chuckled. Bryce did not correct her. Emily looked at me with worried eyes, and I winked so she would not feel responsible for adult meanness. Years passed that way. At Thanksgiving, I brought pies, and Tara joked that I must have clipped a coupon. At Bryce's promotion dinner, the server placed the check near me by mistake, and Bryce snatched it away with a laugh. "Careful," he said. "Dad might faint if he sees real prices." I laughed too, not because it was funny, but because sometimes a father chooses peace over dignity and then spends the drive home wondering if he chose wrong. One winter, their furnace failed during a cold snap, and Bryce called me at 11 at night. I drove over with my tools, found a cracked igniter, and had heat running again in 40 minutes. Tara stood in the hallway wrapped in a robe and said, "At least being cheap made you handy." I washed my hands in their laundry sink while Bryce asked what he owed me. I told him nothing. He pressed $20 into my palm like a tip and said, "Get yourself breakfast." I left it on the counter beside the old part. The next morning, Emily sent me a message that said, "Thank you for keeping us warm." That one line did more for me than any check would have. The bigger disrespect came on my 70th birthday. Emily had arranged a dinner at Bryce and Tara's house, and she put old photos of Ruth and me beside the cake. For a while, I felt almost held. Then Tara handed me a gift bag with a pair of work gloves inside and said, "We figured you could use something practical. Rich people get watches. Walter gets gloves." Bryce added, "Dad never cared about money because money never cared about him." The table laughed, except Emily. She said, "That's not kind." Tara waved her off. "Oh, honey, your grandfather knows we tease because we love him." I looked at Bryce, waiting for the smallest defense. He sliced the cake instead. That night, I sat in my van for several minutes before starting it. Ruth's words came back to me. Not every insult deserves rent in your head. But I wondered what happens when the insult has lived there 20 years and started changing the locks. The bank meeting happened 6 months later. Bryce and Tara had opened an event hall in an old brick building near the river. They called it a venue, though it had started as a warehouse with bad wiring and a roof that needed mercy. I had warned Bryce gently that the numbers looked thin. He told me not to worry. "Business has changed, Dad," he said. "You fixed appliances. This is branding." By spring, branding had missed 4 loan payments. The bank wanted a stronger repayment plan or a partial payoff. Bryce asked me to come to a meeting because, as he put it, he wanted family support. I wore my brown jacket and brought a folder with questions. Tara looked at the folder and whispered, "Please do not start talking about coupons in there." The banker was a careful man named Daniel Morris. He had handled several of my certificates of deposit and knew my trust officer by first name. When I walked into the conference room, Daniel stood straighter than bankers usually do for appliance repairmen. "Good morning, Mr. Ellis," he said. Tara glanced at him. "You know Walter?" Daniel chose his words. "Mr. Ellis has been a client of the bank for many years." Bryce laughed. "He probably still has the account he opened in 1985. Daniel did not laugh. He opened the file and explained that Bryce and Tara owed $18,000 on the commercial note, with $27,500 past due once late fees and taxes were included. The bank could extend 60 days, but only if they brought in cash, collateral, or a qualified guarantor. Tara immediately said her parents were tapped out. Bryce looked at me, then looked away. Daniel asked, "Would Mr. Ellis be part of the repayment plan?" Before I could answer, Bryce said, "No. Don't put Walter on the loan form. They've called him broke for 20 years because he is. We only brought him because he's family, not financing." Tara added, "Honestly, involving him financially would just confuse things." The words did not hit me all at once. They arrived in layers. First embarrassment, then sadness, then a clean, quiet feeling I recognized from the day Ruth died, when pain becomes too large to perform. Daniel's face tightened, but he said nothing. He could not say that the man being dismissed had more cash in that bank than the room knew how to imagine. He could only lower his eyes to the file. I closed my folder. "I understand," I said. Bryce nodded as if I had accepted my place. Tara began discussing whether the bank could forgive some fees as a goodwill gesture. I thought of Ruth at our old kitchen table, drawing columns with a pencil saying money should never be used as a drum. Then I thought of my son using my supposed poverty as furniture, something to lean on while he asked strangers for mercy. I did not raise my voice. I did not tell Bryce what I had. I did not punish him in that room. I simply listened until the meeting ended, shook Daniel's hand, and said, "Thank you for your time." Daniel held my hand a moment longer than necessary. "Mr. Ellis," he said softly, "if you need anything, call me directly." That evening I sat at Ruth's desk and opened the blue binder where our trust papers were kept. I read the note she had tucked inside years before. Help them stand, not pose. I knew then what I had to do. I would not rescue Bryce from truth, but I would not let him drown in pride if there was still a man under it who could learn. The next morning, I called my attorney, Grace Lynn, and then Daniel. By Friday, my family trust had made a formal offer to purchase the event hall's commercial note from the bank. The unpaid balance was $418,000, but because the loan was troubled, the bank accepted $386,500 for an assignment of the note in security interest, subject to standard notice. Grace prepared a restructuring letter. Bryce and Tara would get 90 days without foreclosure action, but after that they had to submit monthly financial statements, sell 2 unused catering vans, complete small business counseling, and make payments through a third-party escrow account. I also revised the $600,000 inheritance I had planned for Bryce into a protected trust for Emily and her younger brother Nathan, released only for education, housing, or medical needs. Every part of it was legal. Every part of it was quiet, and every part of it had a purpose. I was not taking the building, I was taking away the fantasy that disrespect had no cost. The notice arrived at Bryce's office 5 days later. I know because Tara called me by mistake, thinking I was still just the harmless old man who answered his phone at odd hours. "Walter, do you know anything about assignment of note letters?" she asked, breathless. "A little," I said. "The bank sold our loan to some private trust. They will not even tell us who controls it yet." Bryce is furious. This could ruin us. "Did you read the terms? It says we have 90 days to fix the books, sell assets, and use escrow." "Who writes that?" "Someone who wants the business to survive more than the image," I said. She paused. "What does that mean?" "It means you should read the whole letter." By evening, Bryce had called Daniel 3 times, Grace twice, and me not at all. He thought the bank had betrayed him. Tara thought a competitor was trying to steal the building. Denise, Tara's mother, posted a vague message about jealous people attacking success. For once, nobody called me broke. They were too busy being afraid of someone with money. The reveal came through Emily. She was 24 then, working as a nurse and still the only person in the family who visited without needing something fixed. She came by on Sunday with soup because she said my voice sounded tired. I had not meant to tell her, but she saw the assignment papers on Ruth's desk before I could turn them over. "Grandpa," she said, "why does this say Ellis Family Trust?" I sat down slowly. "Because I bought your father's note." Her eyes widened. "You bought the loan on the event hall?" "Yes." "How?" "With money your grandmother and I saved, invested, and protected." She looked around my little kitchen as if it had become a different room. "How much money are we talking about?" "Enough that nobody needed to call me broke. Not enough that anyone gets to stop being decent." Emily sat across from me and covered her mouth. "They humiliated you in that bank. Dad told me part of it, but not that part. Your father was scared. Scared people often reach for the nearest smaller person. You're not smaller." I smiled then because Ruth would have loved her for that. "No, I just stopped trying to look tall." Emily asked why I had never told them. I told her about Ruth, the duplex, the ledgers, the promise. I told her that money can reveal character, but it can also deform it if handed to the wrong moment. She listened without interrupting. For the first time in many years, I said the numbers out loud, to someone who looked at me instead of past me. The kitchen felt less like a hiding place and more like a room Ruth had kept ready for truth. When I finished, she said, "You are giving Dad a way out, but you are making him walk it himself. That is the idea. Then he needs to know who gave him the road." "Not yet. Grandpa, he already used your silence against you. Letting him stay ignorant is not mercy anymore." I hated how right she sounded. Emily asked for permission to speak to Bryce first. I said yes, with one condition. Tell the truth without enjoying the wound. She nodded. "Grandma Ruth, rule. Grandma Ruth, rule." That night, Emily went to her parents' house. I did not go. She told me later that Bryce was at the dining table with bank letters spread around him, looking older than his anger. Tara was pacing. Emily placed a copy of the assignment on the table and pointed to the trust name. "Do you know who Ellis Family Trust belongs to?" she asked. Bryce frowned. "Some investor. Grandpa." Tara stopped walking. Bryce shook his head. "No, Dad does not have that kind of money." Emily said, "That's exactly the sentence that got you here." She told them enough. Not the full balance of my accounts, not every property, not every private thing Ruth and I built. Just enough to make the lie impossible to keep. She told them I had bought the note, delayed foreclosure, protected the grandchildren, and refused to pay $1 toward appearances until they learned to tell the truth. Bryce's first reaction was anger. He said I had tricked him. Emily answered, "No, Dad. You made assumptions and then used them as insults. That is not the same as being tricked." Tara cried and said nobody told her. Emily said, "You did not ask. You laughed. There is a difference." The next morning, Bryce came to my house alone. He parked in the driveway but stayed in the car for nearly 10 minutes. I watched from the window, remembering a boy who once brought me a broken radio and believed I could fix anything. When he finally came in, he looked at Ruth's desk, then at me. "Dad," he said, "I do not know how to apologize without making it sound too small. Start anyway." He sat down. His hands were shaking. He admitted he had been embarrassed by my clothes, my van, my house, because he thought my simplicity reflected failure. He said Tara liked successful people and he had wanted to appear self-made, which apparently required making me look like nothing. Then he said the sentence I had needed more than any confession about money. I let them call you broke because it made me feel bigger. I looked at my son for a long time. There are moments when a parent wants to comfort too quickly, just to stop the child from hurting. I did not. Some pain is the first honest payment on a debt. I love you, I said. But love will not erase the terms. He nodded. I know. You will follow the restructuring plan. You and Tara will sell the unused vans. You will attend counseling for the business. You will stop using my name as a joke. And at the next family dinner, you will correct a story in front of the same people who heard it for years. His face tightened at the last condition. Then he said, I deserve that. Tara came 2 days later. Her apology was messier. She cried, defended herself, blamed stress, then slowly ran out of excuses. I let silence do its work. Finally, she said, I thought if someone looked poor, I had permission to treat them like they had less value. That is ugly, but it is true. I thanked her for telling the truth. I did not hug her that day. Forgiveness can be real and still take its time. The next 90 days changed the family more than the previous 20 years had. Bryce sold the 2 catering vans and paid down $48,000. Tara canceled 3 vanity expenses that had made the business look busier than it was. They met with a counselor who showed them the difference between revenue and applause. The event hall survived, smaller and quieter, which is often how survival begins. At the family dinner in July, Bryce stood before dessert. My sisters, cousins, Tara's parents, Emily, and Nathan were all there. He held a glass of water with both hands and looked miserable, which made me trust the moment more. For years, he said. I let people joke that my father was broke. I said it too. It was false, but worse than that, it was disrespectful. Dad and Mom built more than I understood, and Dad has helped this family in ways most of us did not deserve. I am sorry. I should have known his worth before I knew his accounts. No one laughed. No one knew where to look. Then Emily raised her glass and said, to Grandma Ruth, who probably saw all of this coming. That broke the tension enough for a few smiles. Tara's mother looked like she had swallowed a lemon, but even she managed a quiet apology before leaving. Nathan came to me afterward and asked if I was really rich. I told him, rich enough to buy dinner, not rich enough to skip manners. He repeated that line to Emily, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. Bryce did not become perfect. Neither did Tara. People rarely change in one grand scene, but they did become careful in a better way. They invited me to business meetings and listened when I asked plain questions. Tara stopped performing wealth she did not have. Bryce came by on Saturdays to repair the porch rail I had ignored for years, and for once he did not make a joke about me being cheap. He just sanded, measured, and worked beside me until the old rail stood straight. One afternoon, Daniel Morris saw me at the bank and asked how the family was doing. I told him they were learning. He smiled and said, that is usually the longest loan to repay. He was right. Money can be paid back on a schedule. Respect takes longer because it has to be practiced when nobody is forcing it. But I had seen my son begin, and at my age, beginnings are not small things. Never confuse a quiet life with an empty one. Some people hide their wealth because they are ashamed, and some hide it because they are protecting the people they love from becoming small around it. If you only respect someone after the balance is revealed, the poverty was never in their pocket. They called me broke for 20 years, but the banker knew my name.